Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my January reading wrap-up video. This is my first wrap-up for 2025 and I'm so excited because I have 9 books in total to talk about. This is hands down the best start to a year that I have ever had. I generally find that January is a really difficult month. One, because I'm always trying to figure out what I'm in the mood to read, and I always feel like there's this pressure to read enough so that the year gets off to a good start. And I often feel like if it doesn't get off to a good start, then the rest of the year is going to be really difficult. So 9 books is insane. I think that's like 3 books more than I read last year. One of those was an audiobook, which I'll talk about in a minute. Overall, I'm so happy with how this month has started. I also just want to start this video by saying as well, if you hear any like little snorting or grunting, my dog is currently completely fast asleep next to me and this mic is going to pick it up because it's not a miracle worker. So without further ado, here are the 9 books that I read in January. So the first book that I read, I actually listened to it because it was an audiobook, because one of my goals this year is to listen to one non-fiction audiobook a month, or at least read a non-fiction book as well. Either way, I at least want to fit 12 non-fiction books into my year. And so the first book that I ended up listening to this month was In Order to Live, a North Korean Girl's Journey to Freedom by Yeonmi Park. Now this follows Yeonmi, who was basically a North Korean defector, and it basically details her life when she was living in North Korea and also when she kind of went on her quest to leave North Korea with her mother. I don't give non-fiction books ratings, so if you're new here, there's not going to be a rating for this one. I generally don't feel right rating someone's life story. It just feels kind of weird. I would say overall I found this a really interesting read. North Korea is somewhere that really fascinates me. Obviously, we don't really know much about what goes on inside. The only bits that we really see are the people who live and work in the very prosperous part of North Korea, which is where, you know, the government officials live and the people who work for the government live. If you live and work outside any of that, we don't see it, but we know how awful it is from, you know, the vague reports that we end up getting. But Yeonmi Park actually lived in one of these outskirt villages, which is a place that we don't really get to see or hear about. And so I was very interested to see her story. I did think it was really interesting. However, what I will say is when I got 90% into this audiobook, so I was like virtually finished, I ended up finding out a couple of things that I could have done with knowing before I even started this book. So first of all, there's a lot of controversy from other North Korean defectors, and they've basically said some of her story is very fabricated, which is annoying to hear because I feel like it ends up kind of making it harder for the other North Korean defectors. If you're going to fabricate your story, it just ruins it for everyone else. And the second thing that I could have done with knowing is the fact that she is now a huge MAGA dickhead. Listen, I don't want to make my channel political. I obviously live in the UK, so in theory, American politics should have nothing to do with me. However, I can state my opinion on a certain politician. I think Donald Trump is a knobhead. I think Donald Trump is a knobhead, and I think he's a really dangerous man, is what I'm going to say there. I think words have a lot of power, and so I think that makes him dangerous. I also will say this: if I lived in America and if I was an American citizen, I would not be voting for the Republican Party. They do not align with anything that I believe in. And I think it's crazy that someone who defected from North Korea, which is like the most insane dictatorship going, now ends up supporting a man who loves Kim Jong-un for a start. Like, he made that very clear a couple of years ago. Like, he fucking, oh my god, he has such a bromance with Kim Jong-un. But also just really advocates for, you know, people having guns and all of this stuff. I don't understand how you can come from North Korea and then love that stuff. I don't get it. Like, she's been brainwashed by one place and then she's being brainwashed by another place. Like, I don't know. And especially with what's happened recently with the whole, you know, who's the Tesla dickhead? What the fuck is his name? I can't remember his name. I don't even care to remember his name because of what he did. I really need to go back on her Instagram page and see what she said about that, because if she thinks that's okay... Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I wish I had known that stuff sooner. Now I don't really know how I feel about having listened to this, and I don't really know if I can say that it was a good read, considering the fact that some of her story might be fabricated, but that is literally all I have to say about this. Yeah. The next book that I ended up reading in January was The Heartless Hunter, or if you live somewhere else, it's also called The Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli. So this book is actually told in dual perspectives. We have the perspective of Rune, who is basically a witch in hiding, because in this world there are witches and there are witch hunters, and the witches have been slowly driven out. And if you are found to be a witch, or if you are harbouring witches, then you are basically kind of strung up and slaughtered. Now by day, Rune is pretending to be a socialite, but by night she is something known as the Crimson Moth. And the Crimson Moth is very infamous in this world as someone who is trying to help witches escape from the witch hunters. And this is where our other character Gideon comes in, because he is in fact a witch hunter and he is dead set on capturing the Crimson Moth. And this whole story centres around this plot where Gideon is told by one of his close witch hunter friends that basically they have some information that might lead to the Crimson Moth, and it all has to do with the idea that Rune either is the Crimson Moth or she knows the Crimson Moth. And so Gideon tries his hardest to get close to her, and because of this, at some point Gideon and Rune end up getting very close together, and it turns into something a little bit romantic, shall we say. Now I did actually read this for a romantasy reading vlog, which is actually already up on my channel, so if you want to go check that out, you can. This book took me by surprise. This is very popular on Booktok, which is the reason that I read it, and I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I was so enraptured by this world as soon as I started reading. It was one of those books where I got to the second or third page and I absolutely knew I was going to love this book and I was going to be obsessed with it, and I honestly cannot wait for the sequel that comes out this month. I am so excited. Like, the end of February can't come soon enough. I really loved kind of like the grey storyline that we had going on, because it was kind of like neither side was in the right or wrong. Obviously hunting people and killing them isn't right by any means, but what this story was really showing was that there was an evil side to witchcraft. And I just loved that really grey area that this story painted. Another thing that I loved, which is a trope that I really don't tend to love in books unless it's done very, very well. And the only other time I've seen it done well is by one other author. But I really loved the love triangle in this book. I actually don't mind who this character ends up with. That is all I'm going to say. And that's all I can say, because otherwise it spoils things. But I, in general, just really didn't mind the love triangle with this one, which is so weird, because usually love triangles, I'm like, oh god, they're only put in place, but we know who the person's going to end up with, so like they're really pointless. But I felt like this one was done really well. And the other thing that I felt like was done really well is I felt such a deep connection to certain characters who weren't around anymore, which I feel like is sometimes really hard to do, because obviously if a character isn't there for you to build a bond with, it's kind of hard to feel anything for them. And especially when you know they're already dead and how they've died, it's kind of like really hard to form that connection and feel that emotion behind their character. But I felt like this book did that really well. It was also a really fast-paced read, and I just felt so incredibly immersed in this world, which is also really important for me when I'm reading fantasy. The only downside to this book that I would say is that I wish that there was more time to form a romantic connection between the two characters, because I feel like because they had their separate plot lines going on a lot of the time, there wasn't enough time for them to be together. And because of that, it almost felt a little bit like the romance became instantaneous. There were times where the characters were interacting but they didn't know that they were interacting with each other, but I just felt like because of that I found the romance a little lacking sometimes. And the only other thing that was an issue for me, but it's like a personal issue, is that things did start clicking in the end. So the plot twist wasn't as crazy as it maybe should have been, or probably was for other people. For me, it was pretty obvious, but that's a me issue. I know that's a me issue. But overall, I really love this one. This one is definitely a contender for my top 10 books of 2025 already. And I gave it 4 stars. 1 star was knocked off just for those like couple of negative points that I just gave. So after reading The Crimson Moth, I really needed a palette cleanser. So then I ended up reading a little short story, which I've had my eye on since I believe December, but I was kind of putting this one off because I think the release date was December for the UK, but I think America got it in November. And November was when I discovered it, and then I just kind of like put it on my back burner. But that book is The Answer Is No by Frederick Backman. Now this story basically follows a young man named Luke Lucas, who lives in this apartment building, and Lucas is very fond of being antisocial. He does not really love people, he just wants his own company, and he wants to be left alone, until one day someone knocks on his door and he ends up getting involved in all of this crazy stuff, and he ends up just around a lot of people, which is not where he wants to be. He wants to be left alone. Now, I don't really have much to say on this one because it is a short story. I think it's probably 40 odd pages long. It really isn't long at all. I found this one quite funny. I really enjoyed the humour, and I know that Frederick is a well-loved author by a lot of people. I know he's written a couple of books that are quite emotional, so I wouldn't mind checking him out one day because I actually didn't mind this short story. What I will say though is that I found the story a little bit too far-fetched in the end. It was getting a little bit annoying to the end, to be honest. And whilst it was relatable because I am also very antisocial, I really just don't like people. I want to be left alone. It did become a little bit silly towards the end, which is where it dropped off for me. But overall, I did really enjoy the writing style of it, so I would definitely check out more books by this author in the future. Overall, I gave it 3 stars. I would definitely check it out if you want to maybe read books by this author just to see what he's about and what his writing style's like. But I did enjoy it, so 3 stars, it was okay. I wouldn't say it's a miss, but I wouldn't say it's a hit. The 4th book that I read in January was When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This is the first book in what I assume is either going to be a duology or a trilogy or a series. I'm kind of hoping it's a duology, but who knows? Now, I'm going to try and explain this as best that I can, because this book, there were some negatives, but there were some positives. It was a bit of a mix. So in this book, we are following this young woman named Rave, and she is essentially like a mercenary in this world. And in this world, it's made up of fae. And some fae have powers and other fae don't. And the fae that don't have powers are basically kind of enslaved in this system of poverty, I guess is the way that you could put it. And the fae with powers are basically on top. Now, Rave is mercenary. She is someone who is pretending to be a fae without powers. And then one day, I'm trying to remember what happened in this plot because it's just so much going on in this book. Basically, one day she's captured by the Crown and they essentially are going to execute her to make an example of her because she is actually a mercenary for this rebellion group that the Crown have been trying to take down, and they don't have any information on them, and she just happens to end up being the person that's caught. And then the story kind of goes off and she ends up being tied with this prince named Khan. That's pretty much all I'll say about this book. It's a bit of a confusing one, I'm not gonna lie. If you're confused, I'm confused. So one of the first things that people say about this book, which is why I was really apprehensive to start it, even though I really wanted to because I heard so many good things, is that the world building is confusing. Now, the world building in this book is confusing because it's done badly. It's done very, very poorly. This book is just way too long for what it actually is. It's a romantasy, and it's nearly bordering on 700 pages long. I think it's over 600 pages, but bordering on 700. And it almost feels like it wants to be high fantasy, but it just ends up being confusing as fuck. There are things explained way too late in the book that should have been explained at the beginning. And bear in mind, this book, when you start it, comes with a 20 odd page or some ridiculous amount of pages, glossary or something about the actual world and the world building. No fantasy book should come with that. You should be able to explain your world without putting a explanation at the beginning of the book. I'm just saying. To me, it just felt like the world building was a little bit half-assed most of the time. And it was more confusing than it needed to be. At one point, I remember just trying to not even figure out what was going on with the world. And I was just trying to read it for entertainment value. And at that point was when I actually kind of started enjoying it. Because when you take out all of the world building, it's fine. But when you put in the world building, it's bad. I mean, it's not amazing without the world building either, but it's definitely better. I'm so sorry for that snoring. Can you stop snoring? Oh my god, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you're snoring. You're loud. I'm sorry. Yeah, this book did one of those TikTok things that I absolutely hate that they always do in romantasy, where they will mix modern dialogue with fantasy-esque dialogue. I can't stand it. When I read a fantasy book, I want to have old-timey dialogue, if that makes sense, unless it's like some sort of urban fantasy, or Fourth Wing gets away with it, because Fourth Wing, I don't feel like old-timey dialogue will do it. Like, if it's like fae and vampires and all of that, I want old-timey. I want old-timey dialogue, and I don't want modern language mixed in with that. It just takes you out of the book. Another negative I would say is that there are flashbacks, and the only things that happen in these flashbacks are spice. And it's just so stupid. Like, you're telling me the only thing that you can remember from your flashbacks are spicy things. It's just stupid. What I will say is, though, it was entertaining and it was fast-paced. I read this faster than I expected myself to. The other disappointing thing about this book is if you think dragons are going to be like heavily mixed into this book, they're not. They barely make an appearance, honestly. Like, I was waiting for the dragons and I was like, oh my god, like, dragons, give me dragons. No dragons! No, there are dragons, but they really don't play a big part in the story, which is so funny considering there are, like, dragons on the cover. And I get that they're linked to the story a little bit, but, like, they really don't play that big of a part, which is kind of disappointing. Overall, I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was okay. I did say in my reading vlog that I was going to continue on with this series, but now I'm really not sure. I'm really not sure. Now that I think about it, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can be bothered. I'm really not that fussed about it. The next book that I read in January is one that is definitely going to be making my top 10 of 2025, and that is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. This is the second book in the Part of Your World, I want to say trilogy. I don't think she's writing beyond 3 books, I could be wrong, but it's basically a set of interconnected romances. So every book is following a different character, but like other characters will pop up and they're all kind of like interlinked to each other. And in this particular book, we are following our main character named Brianna, and she is friends with the woman from the first book, and we are also following another character named Jacob. Now, Brianna works at the hospital that her friend used to, and she is kind of looking at a promotion, but she also has a bunch of stuff going on. So her brother is currently searching for a kidney donor, and he's actually really, really ill, and, you know, she feels like time's running out, and so she's dealing with that. She's also dealing with the finalisation of her divorce that's going to be happening because her ex-husband cheated on her. And in comes Jacob, because Jacob comes to the hospital as a brand new doctor and basically takes the rug out from under Brianna, because the guy who's looking to promote someone to take over his position basically turns around and says, look, I want to give Jacob a fair go. You know, he's just come into the mix, so you're probably not going to get promoted yet, but I want to give Jacob a fair chance. And so Brianna gets really annoyed. She basically starts hating Jacob because she has all of this other stuff going on, and then she finds out, now I have to wait for this promotion. Now, Jacob also has his own stuff going on. His brother is now dating his ex-girlfriend who he was with for a couple of years, and he also has really bad anxiety. One day, Jacob starts sending Brianna letters because something happens, and things happen from there. They end up in this whole like fake dating situation, and guys, I know I always say that I love Abby Jimenez whenever I read her books. I've read one of her short stories, and then obviously I read Part of Your World last year. This is my favourite Abby Jimenez book. I genuinely think this is my favourite romance book of all time. The first thing that I will say is I've never felt so seen in a book in all my life. I have never seen myself represented as a character, and it's so weird because it was a male character. I deal with a lot of anxiety, and I've never, honestly, the quotes in this book, there were multiple times where I had to put the book down because I felt myself getting teary, because I was like, oh my god, I've never seen those words written out before, and I've never thought that someone would feel the same as me, or that, like, I always just thought I was weird. Like, there was this one whole quote where basically this happens very early on. Jacob and Brianna end up eating in a little like storage closet, and for the whole day he's worrying about what he's gonna eat and how he's gonna eat with her in the closet, and he's like, eating is such a intimate thing to do with someone, and so it takes him a lot of time to be comfortable to do that around someone. When I read that, I got choked up because I've never I've never in my life read about a character who feels the same way as I do, and I felt so seen. I felt so seen. And like just like little things like he would check Google and check reviews for places to see where he would have to go, and like he would be more comfortable going to places that he'd already been to because he'd know where the toilets are and he wouldn't have to ask anyone. Like just like little things honestly had me choked up in this book. The romance was so beautiful because Brianna was so caring and so gentle with him, and she gave him so much courage, and it was so lovely to see. The slow burn was exquisitely done. Abby Jimenez does some really great slow burn romance, and I really appreciate that. I can understand, however, that there's a lot of miscommunication in this book, and I could probably see that it could be really aggravating for some readers because there is a lot of back and forth and it's very samey after a while, but I really didn't mind it. But overall, this is my favourite one in the series so far. This is my favourite Abby Jimenez book ever. I don't think that will ever change. I obviously really loved seeing Brianna's struggles as well. But for me, Jacob really topped off this book. I've never felt so seen by a book in all my life, and genuinely, I don't think I'll ever get over it. I genuinely think this is my favourite romance book of all time. And if you couldn't guess, I gave this one 5 stars. The next book that I read in January was one that is probably going to be making my worst books of 2025. So we've gone from one spectrum to the other. And that is The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon. So this is another romantasy. Before I even start this, let's just say that it is a Kylo Ren and Rey fanfiction. And I feel like that's all you need to know. But essentially in this book we are following our main character named Taliesin, and she lives in this world that is basically war-torn. There are these 2 continents that have been warring for years, and she herself is an orphan because of this war, and she is fighting for the good side, or the light side you might say, and the side that she is fighting against is the Empire. Now fighting for the Empire is the prince of this Shadow Empire named Alaric, who is obviously our Kylo Ren of the story. And I feel like that's all you need to know. Basically, they end up having this little battle between them, and that's how they meet, and then they can't get each other off their minds. They want to kill each other, but they also want to fuck. I just don't know what else to say about this book. Honestly, by that description, you would think, oh, it's like one of those smutty little romances. It's not. Nothing happens. It's boring. I have to like come out and say this straight away. I got 30% into this book and then I had to switch to the audio because I genuinely could not fathom having to slug through reading this. It was awful. It was so boring. I was bored to tears, which is crazy because a lot of this book is dealing with the political side of the story, and really the romance is only a small part of it. So you would think that it would be right up my street because I love very like politically dominated fantasy stories, but there was nothing going on. It was like the same thing over and over again, and the plot was so boring. And honestly, the world building was really bad as well. First of all, the pacing was so off. It almost felt like you were plunged into this story and you were having to be forced to feel for characters that you felt nothing for. Like a character at the beginning died and you were supposed to feel really sad about it, but you hadn't even really known this character, but it like ended up being a massive thing throughout the story that, oh, Taliesin's really sad about it, so you have to be sad about it too. But it's like, how am I supposed to be sad about it when I've just entered the story? It was also incredibly info dumpy as well, and I almost felt as if the world building was done badly, just because I feel as if you're meant to go into this as a Star Wars fan. Like, you're meant to go into this having already watched Star Wars, because if you don't, nothing will make sense. It's just done really badly. It's so info dumpy and wordy unnecessarily. And again, the characters are really flat. It's almost like you're supposed to go into this knowing it's a fan fiction. I mean, Taliesin, I did have like my own vision of what she was like, but at the same time, even if I could picture the character differently from what the actors are, I was still imagining the characters in the film, because that's all you got. Like, they were just flat. There was no separate characterization to them. It also felt like the descriptions a lot of the time were saying a lot and then saying nothing at all, and there was a lot of back and forth that was very samey. I really didn't like this one. I don't understand what people saw in it. Obviously people did enjoy it, but I did see on TikTok, because I put something up about it, And people actually said that when they read the second one, they thought it was awful, even though they loved the first one. So maybe they were just going off the hype. I don't know. But I really didn't like this. I ended up giving it a 1 star. It was bad. It was bad. And I'm not being funny, but like I feel like any romancy can be enjoyable, even if it feels the same as something else. But this was just not well done at all. So the next book that I read in January was Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. Now this is a horror story that is set in the 70s, and we are following our main character named Fern, who is 15 years old, and she is being sent to a maternity home, which back in the 70s this was like a huge thing. I did not realise it was a thing in America as well. It did also happen here in the UK, but it was basically a place where families would send their either really young teenage daughters who got pregnant, or they would send unmarried mothers there as well to basically wait out their pregnancy, have their babies, and the babies would be snatched from them, and then they would just have to go about their lives as if it never happened. It was kind of like an out of sight, out of mind thing. Now we're following a 15-year-old girl named Fern, and she's sent there by her family, and while she is there, she ends up being given this book for basically witchcraft, and the girls that she makes friends with read through this book, and they actually end up finding their own power within this book, and they almost feel as if they now have an advantage. Power is now in their hands where before it wasn't, and things happen. That's all I'm gonna say. Now this was my first Grady Hendrix book, so I didn't really know what to think going into it. I've wanted to read a Grady Hendrix book for a while. Now what I will say, I did really enjoy this one. However, what I will say is, if you're gonna go into this one, don't go into it thinking it's a horror. This one reads more like a historical fiction with a little, and I mean a little dusting of horror elements. If I'm being honest, if the horror elements were taken out of this, I think I would have enjoyed it even more. Like, if this was dubbed as a historical fiction, I think I would have enjoyed it way more. I think that this was definitely a case of it being misadvertised. It's still being pushed as a horror, which I don't understand because there's not a lot of horror in it. There is a little bit of body horror. There's some horror to do with like witchcraft, but like there's really not much in there. Most of the story is very like character driven. It's very history driven. It doesn't make it less enjoyable, but I think if you're going into this thinking, oh my god, it's a horror book, you're going to be disappointed. I did think at the beginning, I think like until it got up to 30% into the book, I did feel like it was very slow paced, and I think it was just to do with the fact that I was expecting more horror than there was. I did really love how character centered this story was because I wasn't expecting that, and I definitely was not expecting how emotional this book made me. I'm not gonna lie, this book made me cry. This was the second book that made me cry in the month, because the first book that made me cry was The Crimson Moth, and I was not expecting this book to make me tear up, but I was literally crying at the end of this book. And this is also the first book where I have read from front to back the acknowledgements, because I was so astounded with how well I thought this book was done. It just felt so well researched. The whole time I was reading this book, I could just feel the fear and the powerlessness of these girls who were put in this home, and obviously they're having to deal with the changes in their body, the fact that their families don't want them anymore, and all of this other stuff. And it just felt so incredibly well done, especially for a male author as well. I will say that not once when I was reading this did I feel like I was reading from a male perspective, and so that's why I read the acknowledgements, because I was very interested to understand why he wrote this book and how he did it so well. And it turns out he actually had people in his family that actually went to maternity homes, and he didn't find out until he was in college, and so that was why he was so determined to write this book. And the acknowledgements made me cry as well. Honestly, I loved this. I did only take a star off because of the slow pacing a little bit, and also the fact that I went into this expecting a full-on horror. So I did give it 4 stars, but genuinely, I love this one. I would absolutely recommend this one just for the history alone. So then the next book that I read in January should come as no surprise, because I in fact read Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros. This is the 3rd book in the Empyrean series. Now this world is basically centered around this military college, and in the 1st book we are following our main character Violet, who is basically entering into this military college. Now she has trained her whole life to become a scribe, and the scribes basically deal deal with maps, they deal with books, they write up histories, and she has trained all of her life to do this. However, her mother forces her into the Riders Quadrant. Now, the Riders Quadrant is the most infamous of them all because they are in fact dragon riders, and you literally could die before you even get your dragon. So she is up against a lot in this series. She also has a chronic illness as well, and it's basically, I don't know what the actual term for it is because I always forget. I'm sure it's said somewhere, but it basically makes her bones quite weak. Her bones can pop out of their sockets quite easily, and obviously the Riders Quadrant is quite physically draining, and so for Violet it's even harder. And also in the first book we are introduced to a character named Xaden Ryerson, who basically has it out for Violet. Violet is told to stay away from him because he's dangerous, and his father basically started this huge uprising, and it basically resulted in Violet's mother executing Xaden's father. So Xaden basically has it out from Violet from the beginning. So not only is she trying to make it through the Riders Quadrant alive, she's also trying to stay away from Xaden, who probably wants to kill her. That is all I'm going to say about that because it's one you should probably just read for yourself. Now, I will start by saying that this is a huge guilty pleasure series for me. Can I see its faults? Yes. Look, listen, it uses modern language. It's very cheesy at times. The writing is so easy to read and follow. It's giving Booktok is what I'll say. If you're kind of into your heavier, more well-written fantasy, this might not be for you, but this is very much a guilty pleasure read for me. I fucking love this series. I'm not gonna lie, when it's over, I'm gonna actually die. Now, I did rate this one lower than the last two books. I think my favourite, it's really hard. I really loved the first one, and I did actually really love the second one as well. I think the first one is still my favourite overall. The second one was my favourite for an entirely different reason. This one I did rate down a little bit. The main reason is because it was very confusing going in. I feel like one of the things that I've noticed with Rebecca's writing so far is that it almost feels like she writes as if she expects everyone to reread her books. I'm not a huge rereader. I don't do it. I do actually feel like I will do a reread of this series at some point via audio, just because I just really enjoy it so much and I love being in this world. But in general, I won't go back and reread books because I don't feel the need to. And I feel like what a good fantasy author should do is introduce you to a new book in the series effortlessly so that you remember the plot of the last book and the characters and what's going on without being so utterly confused. And I was super confused when I went into this. I did find that with the second one, but I got into it so much quicker. With this one, it was a struggle. There was a lot of political things happening. There was a lot of like battles and war talk, and there were a lot of characters that were introduced and reintroduced, and it just was very, very confusing for me as a reader, which I've never really found with any other fantasy before. The other thing that I feel like I might have rated this down for is the ending. Don't get me wrong, I liked the ending. The pacing just felt really weird. It was almost like the whole book was kind of like a little bit of a slow burn, and then all of a sudden at the end it was like, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and bam, the end. And I was just kind of like, and my brain was trying to catch up, and it literally took me a day before it even hit me what had happened. And then I did find myself in this void staring at the wall, wondering what I was going to do with my life. I did really love this. I'm not going to lie, like, I know there have been a lot of negative reactions on this one, and I can understand why. A lot of people have said they feel like this book is a filler. I know originally this series was technically meant to be a trilogy. I personally didn't mind this as a filler. I did enjoy seeing kind of things play out that had to do with the ending of the last book. I felt like that was pretty well done. Oh, the other thing I'll say is I almost feel like the ending of this book felt like it should have been the ending of the last book. Like I did like the ending of the last book, but I wasn't like, oh my god, what am I going to do for like the year or 2 years that I need to wait for the next one? Whereas this one, I am in despair. My brain is currently going, hello darkness, my old friend. Because it's just like, honestly, I didn't believe everyone when they said that there was going to be a 2 year plus wait for the next book, and I genuinely, why would you do that? Why would you do that? I'm not gonna lie, it did make me cry. Overall it was fun. I still really enjoyed it. I fucking loved this world. There were so many moments in this book that had me kicking my feet, giggling, screaming, crying, throwing up, and overall I gave it 4 stars. So I did rate it down 1 star from the previous 2 books. I still really loved it. just had a little couple of issues with it. But overall, I still fucking love this series. It's such a guilty pleasure for me. So then the 9th and final book that I read in January, I honestly wasn't expecting to finish this one, but it actually turned out to be a lot shorter than I originally thought it was. And that is The Crash by Frida McFadden. This is Frida McFadden's new release for 2025. And in this book, we are following a 23-year-old young woman named Tegan who is currently pregnant, and she's very far along in her pregnancy when she decides that she's going to go and visit her brother because she's kind of feeling down on her luck a little bit. You know, things are going on with her and she kind of just wants to be with him before the baby arrives. At which point, when she's driving, there is a massive snowstorm. She ends up crashing her car and she ends up being rescued and taken to this home which is owned by a couple, but this couple isn't all what they seem. The story goes from there. I really liked the idea of this story before I went into it. The reason that I read Frida McFadden a lot of the time is because her stories are so easy and quick to read. I have noticed, however, that like I almost feel like the quality of the books is going down. I'm not gonna lie. My favourite one so far is definitely The Teacher. I really love that one. I also really love the first Housemaid book, but I feel like the books that I've read from her recently, I haven't loved that much. Like, they felt a little bit pointless and they almost feel a little bit like the same. When I read a thriller, I want to be thrilled, and I'm going to tell you right now, this book did not thrill me at all. It was so obvious where the plot was going. There were supposed to be plot twists, but they weren't plot twists because they were literally jumping out at you. I also found this book to be a little bit too outlandish for my liking. Listen, I don't read for realism. I don't read because I want things to be realistic. And, you know, I know thrillers, you know, are set in the real world or whatever. I want to be thrilled. I want to be shocked. This didn't do any of those things. There was literally one of the twists which I didn't see coming, but it was so ridiculous. It just came out of nowhere. It made no sense whatsoever. I also found that this book was very repetitive after a while. Most of the book actually takes place whilst Tegan is in a room, and so you're just kind of dealing with her day in, day out rituals spent in this room, and that's basically it. The other thing that I'll say is this book just felt like a massive miscommunication trope. Like, it's a miscommunication trope thriller. That's what we'll go with. It's one of those stories where you pick it up, you read it, and you instantly forget everything that book had in it. I didn't love it, and I gonna be honest, it's the worst Frida McFadden book that I've read so far. I'm just glad it was as short as it was, because I think if it had been anywhere like near 400-500 pages, it would have been way too much. Overall, it was a quick read, but it was really disappointing, and I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it. I did in fact end up giving this one 2 stars, so it was very disappointing to say the least. So those were the 9 books that I read in January. If you've read any of the books that I did, then please leave a comment below telling me what you thought of them. If not, let me know what your favourite book or least favourite book of January was. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content from me, then don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. So bye guys.